Now crossing to our correspondent at the UN, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. He's in New York at the UN. Sherwin, today was all about climate change, and one person who's been under fire for quite some time since taking over the top job in America was Donald Trump, and this was his first chance to speak his truth. How did it go?
Well, you correctly point out, Peter, that the UN General Assembly gets underway tomorrow. This is when heads of state will present their country statements, as is the tradition here, to, you hope, a packed General Assembly. Certainly will be packed for President Donald Trump, his first speech to the General Assembly. But he did stop by the UN precinct here today for about 30 minutes to host a meeting on UN reform. Not the UN reform many South Africans or Africans will be thinking of in terms of reforming the UN Security Council or the peace and security apparatus in the United Nations. This was to support the already existing Secretary General's reform agenda to really streamline the United Nations in terms of making it fit for purpose, in terms of how it sends its peacekeeping troops around the world so that it can respond more agilely in a more nimble way to crises as they develop around the world. So he came in, he spoke a bit in terms of endorsing the Secretary General's agenda, took a few pictures, and then left in his convoy to Trump Towers, where I can tell you he is expecting to meet with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu later today. He will, of course, also meet with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas during his visit here in New York. And just also to talk a little bit about climate change, you do mention that it's a big focus here in terms, I think, of the action taken by President Donald Trump in announcing the withdrawal. Remember, they're not withdrawn yet from the Paris Climate Change Agreement. That process will take a year or two in terms of, leaving the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And what we're seeing here is very much, whether it's the Africans meeting at AU House around the corner where President Zuma participated, or right here at the United Nations just a short time ago, the Secretary General had alongside him Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York. He was joined by, who is also the current UN climate envoy and the Secretary General's envoy on cities, and the governor of California, Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown oversees the 6th largest economy in the world, and he has literally given the thumbs down to the actions by the federal government led by President Donald Trump in terms of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And they're saying we're going to go it alone. What they've created is something called America's Pledge. And what America's Pledge does, it is a coalition of universities, of businesses, of states, of cities that are saying we are going to enforce the goals of the Climate Change Agreement, and we will report back to the United Nations on the progress that American cities, American states, American businesses are making. So we are not going to wait for the federal government under President Donald Trump, who calls climate change a hoax. We are going to go it alone.
So, a lot to discuss just on climate, but I guess things like North Korea will definitely be a talking point from tomorrow.
Absolutely. We understand that later in the week, the Security Council might actually take up the issue, given the fact that, countries are represented here at the highest level. So you might see President Donald Trump in the Security Council. But not only North Korea, although the Secretary General has referred to that as the biggest crisis facing the world today. I can also tell you, Peter, that, there is a great deal of concern in terms of the backsliding we are seeing in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's a great deal of concern around the slow progress made under the IGAD leadership in trying to bring peace back to South Sudan. Mali, for example, is a conflict theater that has taken so many UN peacekeepers' lives. So as much as North Korea seems to grab the headlines, certainly given prominence by the US administration, there are many hotspots around the world. I mean, it's astounding that we're not even talking about Syria today. In its 7th year of conflict, hundreds of thousands of people have died, and the conversation really seems to be focused on Kim Jong-un and Pyongyang, and not all the plethora of conflicts we have that certainly need the world's attention here today.
All right, so our own president is there. Today it was about climate. What else might South Africa and the African delegations bring to the party?
Well, it's just after 1 p.m. here, so we have much of the day still ahead of us. President Zuma will meet with Secretary General Antonio Guterres in a bilateral later this afternoon. That'll be at around 11 p.m. South African time. He will also participate in a very high-level meeting to look at the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse. Of course, there has been a black mark next to the UN's names in terms of peacekeeping, peacekeepers around the world not living up to the standards that the UN has set for them. Hundreds of cases of sexual abuse and exploitation, where peacekeepers are not only have not been sent in just to keep the peace, they've actually abused that authority. And so a high-level meeting, President Zuma will be participating in that. There have been a number of cases involving South African National Defence Force troops, particularly in missions like the Democratic Republic of Congo, MONUSCO, where South Africa has a number of contingents. But one positive out of that, Peter, is that South Africa has been lauded for its response to dealing with those cases. Very much a standard bearer in terms of how the South African National Defence Force has responded to those cases. And so South Africa, although certainly not praised for some of the perpetrators of those crimes, but certainly praised for its response to it.
All right, Sherwin, that's where we're going to leave it. Thanks very much indeed. And we'll be chatting to Sherwin quite a bit over the next 2-3 days as the world leaders gather in New York for this UN General Assembly, Francis.
And I like that African countries are becoming champions for going green, for climate change. I think that's great, since we are often the victims
but human reform, I think, is the biggest issue. You know, this idea that 6 nations can decide the fate of everything is probably outdated. It maybe had its value post-World War II, but this is 2017.
But how do you reconfigure? It's a very difficult thing. All right, ponder on that. We take a short break. We'll be back.